this webinar organized by the International Cooperation Platform, or as we know it in Turkey, the Uluslararası İşbirliği Platformu. My name is Piotr Zalewski, and I am the Turkey correspondent of The Economist. And today I have the pleasure of moderating our conversation with Professor İlter Turan. Just some ground rules before we kick off. Throughout the conversation, our audience will be on mute, so if you have any unruly pets or unruly children, there's nothing to worry about. And Professor İlter Turan will be taking some questions after our initial interview. So please, if you do have a comment or a question, please send it through in the Zoom chat or via YouTube or Facebook, depending on where you are following us. With that, we move on. The topic of our chat, as you know, is the world after COVID-19. The pandemic has been the most disruptive global event since the Second World War. It has disrupted the way we consume, the way we interact, as we see here, the way we trade, and it has disrupted democratic processes around the globe. So far, the pandemic has forced elections to be postponed or cancelled in France, in Serbia, in North Macedonia, in Bolivia, and in Poland, among others. In America, 19 states at this point have had to cancel or postpone their primaries. And at this rate, scores of other elections may be derailed, and perhaps even America's presidential election this November. I'm sure we've all read our share of articles on the global economy after COVID, on agriculture after COVID, on sports, cities, barbershops after COVID. Some of these conclude that nothing will be the same, and some of them conclude nothing will change, but all of them contain more questions than answers. It was already quite a struggle to understand the world before COVID. It's an even bigger struggle to understand the world during COVID. And to hypothesize about the world after COVID takes more than a fair share of intellectual courage. Luckily, our guest speaker today does not lack for intellectual courage. Professor İlter Turan is Professor Emeritus of Political Science at Istanbul Bilgi University, where he has researched and written on comparative politics, Turkish politics and foreign policy, and a host of other issues. He has previously taught at Istanbul University, where he was president, Koç University, the universities of California, Berkeley, Iowa, Wisconsin, and Arizona, as well as St. Anthony's College and Nuffield College in Oxford. He is a senior columnist for the Economics Daily Dünya and a contributor to the On Turkey series presented by the German Marshall Fund. And today, at least for the next 60 minutes or so, he is all ours. Professor, thank you very much, and let's kick off. My first question to you is, again, before we start speculating about the world after COVID, give us a sense of what the world looks like today.
Well, thank you very much, Piotr. Actually, your introduction gave an indication of what the world looks like today, because, number one, we don't know how to fight the virus very well yet. And secondly, don't know how long this is going to last. And different societies are trying to cope with the crisis in a different way. And what we witness looking at the globe is what we would define as a rather confused state of affairs. But there seems to be two sort of conflicting or two areas in which there is a problem of conflicting pressures. The first one, the virus is moving around the world. It's an international phenomenon. And if you have an international phenomenon, it would only be normal that you try to cope with it by organizing internationally. but countries insist on their proclivity to address the challenge within the framework of the nation state. In fact, the imperative of international cooperation and the proclivity to insist on solutions within the framework of the nation state is one sort of problem area. The other one is in the field of economics. Obviously, the most effective technology to keep the virus from spreading is to isolate people. That essentially means that people don't go out to eat, people don't go shopping regularly, people don't do many things that they're used to doing, including even taking the subway or taking a walk in the parks, going to shopping malls, etc. So, of course, there is a whole economy that is built on this sort of relationships, and isolation runs counter to that. So, on the one hand, the governments feel the pressure to bring the virus under control, which pressures them in the direction of isolation. But at the same time, as the economies crumble and many people suffer from the decline of economic activity, they are hard-pressed to avert economic collapse, and they're trying to introduce measures, including letting people to have a bit more freedom of movement, so that the economy can survive. So, I mean, there are these two problems, the need for international cooperation, but the insistence on national solutions, the need for isolation, but the pressure to keep the economies running. These are the two major sort of trends that I witness in the world today, which put together reflects a rather confused response to the pandemic.
And if you were to take a snapshot of prevailing global trends today, and to try to extrapolate whether or not COVID-19 or the looming economic crisis will accelerate those trends, what picture would we have?
Okay, let me first introduce a word of caution. When we try to sort of look at current developments, then use them to make predictions or prognoses regarding the future, we are likely to be proven wrong. The longer term the prediction is made for, the greater the chances that we shall make a mistake or we will be wrong. I mean, after all, we might remember that many people in 1929, days before the Great Depression started, were still hoping that they would become rich one day buying stocks. And similarly, none of us really predicted the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so, one has to be very cautious about rendering predictions about the future. The human ability to predict the future is rather poor, as evidenced by the two examples I have offered. But, maybe we could go and look at the prevailing global trends when the virus first came. What were these trends? What were we witnessing when we encountered the virus? And, because I think the virus comes on top of these trends, and the outcome will be shaped by these trends. In fact, sometimes some of the outcomes that we may attribute to the virus may well be the natural outcomes of trends that were already ongoing before the virus struck. I mean, let us take a look at global politics, for example. Already there was evidence that the global system of governance was quite rapidly eroding. And no single country or no group of countries have the ability or the capacity to politically or economically to drive the global agenda. We must remember that this was done by the United States after the Second World War. the United States led the effort to construct a world system of governance. The United Nations came, and it's all its affiliated agencies, and including those in the economic domain. But there's no one like that now. And secondly, we know that there was an intensifying reaction to globalization, and there was an accompanying decline of the willingness of national governments to search for solutions to global problems through instruments of international cooperation. I mean, this actually may be in part explication of the first point, but also it is an independent process because globalization was a process not necessarily initiated right after the Second World War. This is more a product of the 1980s. And globalization had spread with the neoliberal economic order, and capital was free to move. Companies were could locate and relocate, etc. Technology would move from place to place, and the customs duties and other impediments to trade would be reduced. I mean, these were all part of this globalization process, and already there was a reaction to this. In fact, you know, when you hear President Trump in his campaign clamoring America first, he was registering a reaction to globalization and the role the United States was playing in the globalization. So we have, you know, these trends, plus, you know, in the absence of yet a global system of governance, we have a sort of new two centers of two poles emerging. There is an emergence, in fact, or maybe an intensification of the competition for the number one spot in the global system in the United States and increasingly China. I mean, China isn't yet there, but the United States is trying to force all its allies to join in a campaign to make sure that China doesn't go ahead further and become an even more formidable force in international politics. You know, this is the international politics domain.
You mentioned.
Let me turn maybe to
I was going to ask you
trends in domestic politics.
Sure.
Because these are also important in explaining why many countries are reacting to the pandemic in the way they are. I mean, in many societies, there was a rise of the anti-establishment populist movements as a challenge to the traditional ruling elites of societies, and their achieving power in some societies was a reality, and in societies where the populist forces did not achieve power, they became number one formidable forces in domestic politics just the same. And this forced the establishment parties to take some of the items away from the agenda of populist parties. And then there was another domestic political trend, and that is all governments, but particularly populist governments, showed a tendency to grow more authoritarian, in the process mobilizing anti-immigration and anti-minority sentiments, and also mobilizing all kinds of what you might call external enemy arguments. And then there were economic trends. I mean, the world economy was already experiencing a slump before the virus struck. And also there was a rather interesting development, you know, for a long time for the private corporations, be they national and eventually many become multinational, profit maximization was the critical value that they were trying to achieve. But this value was beginning to come under critical questioning. And the new line of thinking was one that gave importance not only to profits, but also to serving the interests of other stakeholders in the economy. So, this meant that the corporation would take a greater interest in climate change. They would take a greater interest in health problems and eradicating poverty, etc. Now, this defining the social functions and responsibilities of the corporation had evolved into a major business theme. But there was one area where change wasn't necessarily taking place, although there was talk about the social functions of the corporation. The neoliberal approach of limiting the role of government to regulatory question was still in place, and it had not come under fundamental challenge. And finally, one could also talk about the rising importance of digitalization in our lives, including in the economic domain. There were already experiments as regards getting some people to work from home. Some companies were conducting experiments like everybody works from home on Friday or something like that. There was certainly, and we're all very familiar with the growth of internet banking and internet shopping, the growth of webinars and virtual committee meetings. And there was also significant developments in the educational field. I mean, there is something called Booksmesse open online courses that were being offered by a number of universities. Actually, in the United States, a number of internet universities started. They did not prove to be particularly vibrant, but there were ongoing experiments. So, there were many trends of change as we entered the coronavirus pandemic.
Yeah. And,
So,
like you said, I mean, a lot of the technologies were already there. I mean, language
do
learning
you hear
online.
me?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me? Yep.
Hello.
Yes, I can hear you. Let me remove my headphones. Maybe that'll make things.
Do you hear me?
What about me? Can you hear me?
Do you hear me?
Yes.
I can't hear you. I can't hear you. I can't hear you.
Okay. I mean, I think you should be able to hear me. Now, I think, what about now? I can hear you loud and clear. But it seems like you're not getting sound on your end. was
Yeah.
already available, and a lot of people, including myself, have just discovered it now because this is what we have to do. So I'm now learning a language online, and it's proceeding quite smoothly. But it's a technology I simply was not familiar with or did not trust before the pandemic. Closing that parenthesis, you gave us an idea, I think, of what some of these global trends were. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how they have been affected by the pandemic, where we are today.
But essentially, before going on to how they're affected, let me just say a little bit more on maybe the global situation. The pandemic so far seems not to have really encouraged greater cooperation among countries, even with regard to the pandemic. The United States has tried to utilize the pandemic to isolate China and to attack the World Health Organization, for example. Presumably, this is an emergency in which you have to cooperate, but it's become an element of contention. In fact, the limited cooperation with regard to developing a vaccine or sending assistance to other parts of the world, the countries that are hit by the virus, seem to remain within the existing framework of international cooperation. And, if I may venture a prediction, I have a feeling that the World Health Organization that comes under severe attack now will come under even more severe attack after the pandemic. And my fear would be that it could become paralyzed without an alternative institutional framework that would emerge to replace it. And if I'm a prediction, I have a feeling that the U.S.-China conflict will proceed without being much affected, constitute just another issue of contention. Mutual dependence is very powerful, and that would protect us against a full economic rupture, but I think we shall witness an even more competitive set of relationships between China and the United States.
And on the domestic angle, I'm curious, you mentioned the America First sentiment. How will that change? How has the pandemic changed nationalist sentiments in the U.S., across Europe, and elsewhere?
Well, I think the pandemic has produced many influences on the domestic politics of societies already. First of all, the pandemic has produced an environment in which defenses against government intrusion into the private lives of citizens has influences on the domestic politics been considerably weakened. First of all, another way of putting it is that the government is now at greater liberty to pry or to probe into the private lives of citizens, monitoring their movements, and this is perceived to be a legitimate necessity by the masses. But of course, my concern is once these defenses are broken down, after the pandemic goes, the government will still retain this approach of interfering more and more into the private life. So citizens keeping records of it, intruding in a variety of ways. And so some governments have also acquired new powers or expanded their existing powers to rule by decree. This, again, is justified on account of the pandemic, but it is not certain that these are sunset law type things. In other words, after the pandemic, these powers of government will not recede. The powers will remain in the books, and the governments will say it is necessary to have them to cope with other emergencies. Of course, when you have these powers, then the governments may develop a tendency to present many developments as emergencies, which will justify the rule by decree. If you don't believe me, you may look at Hungary. But then there is also the fact that the emergency has enhanced the role of law enforcement agencies, because people have to be kept at home, and social sort of movements have to be controlled. And it has also enhanced the role of the military, because military is used in delivering materials and offering medical assistance, etc. I think this may lead to a review of how these institutions may be trained and re-equipped and strengthened to meet national emergencies. Because you may have noted that we're talking about the virus as another war, a global war. And so to fight the war, you have to train and equip the agencies that are fighting wars to fight this type of a war as well. But all in all, many governments, whether they are authoritarian or democratic, have appeared to be rather inept in addressing the crisis. This may lead in many societies to the discrediting of the ruling elites. And this will, I would unfortunately be afraid, lead to paving the way to the rise of new populist movements. In other words, populist governments may be discredited during this process. I mean, I think many people think, for example, that the Trump government is not going to come out with golden medals out of this ordeal. But then, I think the pressure to elect other populist governments or force governments in the direction of populism will be great. And we are already witnessing a consequence that was in the making before the pandemic came: the tendency against immigrants, disadvantaged minority populations, where the incidence of illness may have been more severe, has been rather powerful. But if one were to search for a bright light in this, it has become quite evident that in addition to powers for any central government, the local governments are extremely important in delivering support to the people who are in need, who cannot take care of themselves because of the illness, who have lost their businesses or jobs, etc. And here, we may possibly offer the optimistic conclusion that local governments might receive greater powers, which one might call a democratizing outcome.
And on the economy, I mean, already, we were looking at prognoses of a global slowdown. Obviously, the world is in for quite a bit of economic pain, an unprecedented level of economic pain in some quarters because of the COVID-19 crisis. How bad do you expect things to get?
Well, I don't know if it is things getting bad, but I think, some of the basic tenets of the neoliberal order have come under challenge.
Yeah.
I think because the economies are suffering significantly, particularly small to medium-sized enterprises in the service sector are suffering extensively. Governments are having to offer economic assistance to these. Now, the premise of the neoliberal order was that market failures were market failures. They were normal. And if some outfits some businesses fail, they should be allowed to fail. So there was a rejection of extending support to enterprises that experience difficulties. But now governments have made very large sums of money available to the economy. In fact, it is almost revolutionary that the United States government first made $2 trillion available. And it's my understanding that they're now going to make another $3 trillion available. This is a huge amount of money, but huge economies obviously have to spend huge amounts of money to keep the economy running when everything is closed down. So what I would predict is that there will be an effort to develop mechanisms in the future of coping with extensive market failure. Because market failure in this particular instance was not something that came to people because they did something wrong. It came when they were prospering in the United States, when suddenly, this virus comes and, you have to close your McDonald's, or you have to close your clothing store, or you have to close your 5 store, whatever. And so these were not market failures in the sense that the people running the business made poor market economies are suffering significantly, extensively. It has also become very apparent that governments had to assume additional responsibilities in terms of coping with unemployment, healthcare, inequality of income that becomes defined as poverty. But nevertheless, what the state will do and whether the effects will be long-lasting will be affected by how long the pandemic lasts and how rapidly economic recovery occurs. If just by a stroke of luck, the pandemic began to recede quickly and the economic recovery began rapidly, maybe people will say, well, this was another thing. But if it lasts long, and it may, there was an announcement by the World Health Organization that this might be around for 5 years and we have to learn to live with it. Then, we have to develop mechanisms to cope with unemployment and offering greater health care to all segments of the population and poverty. But my own hunch is that it will take a prolonged effort to restore high levels of economic activity and prosperity, particularly since each country will search for its own solutions. I mean, it would be easier to have an economic restoration if countries were willing to cooperate. But it seems that each country is going to search for its own solutions, and this is going to probably slow down economic recovery. Of course, this is not going to lead to an end of capitalism. So some of the futurist people have said, we have come to the end of capitalism. My hunch is that we haven't come to the end of capitalism, and capitalism, like other systems, will adjust to new challenges. And how it will adjust will depend on what kind of capitalism exists in a society. Like in China is a capitalist society too, and there I think there will be a strengthening of authoritarian government. And in other Western societies, capitalism will improve itself by enhancing the features of the social welfare state. But there is one sort of outcome that seems to be finding more support, and it has become all too evident that many countries have become too dependent on a few suppliers, and sometimes one, which often is China. So I think two types of responses taken together will try to compensate for this sort of weakness, this reliance on too few suppliers. There will be an attempt to have introduce a greater variation of suppliers, even if this may mean slightly higher costs. And there will be also an enhancement of autarkic tendencies in critical products. There is a talk that some of the medication should be produced nationally. The epidemic demonstrated that some of the health equipment, medical equipment, could be produced nationally, etc. And my fear is that, once you introduce this sort of a critical list of products, of course, all products would claim that they are critical, and the list would tend to grow and enhance the sort of protectionist tendencies this COVID crisis has led to high levels of.
And it's by now always said that within a crisis lies an opportunity or opportunities. This one not excluded, but if you were to start mining for opportunities within this crisis, opportunities especially for innovation, what comes to mind? What industries, what sectors might benefit down the line?
Well, I love this expression, Piotr. People say every crisis brings with it opportunities. Of course, this is true from a historical perspective, but for the people that are going through the crisis, these opportunities are not fun. But let me sort of try to identify some possible. And capitalism, like others, will depend on what kind of capitalism exists in the society. Like we were already talking, or we talked earlier about digitalization. Now, there were experiments going on, but the pandemic is sort of like a dam breaking loose. Just to give an example from Turkey, all of a sudden, primary schools, high schools, universities were forced to offer online courses. Some had greater experience with this, others did not, but this forced all institutions to develop this capability, and all professors and assistant professors, etc., had to learn how to teach a course on the internet. So, this inevitably will have an effect. And this will fall in line already with the idea that higher education is now becoming so costly that it is no longer justified. But by that I mean, people invest a lot, and it's not always very clear that the education you receive enhances your income to such a level that the investment is worth. Reducing the cost of higher education and other education as well. Then, we have learned also that many people can work from their offices, and many can also work from their homes. And now there will be a greater tendency to get some people to work from their homes. And this is, of course, a very economical move, because by getting people to work at home, you are saving on office space, you're saving on transportation to work and back. So you're also not only saving on the cost of transportation, but you're also saving on time. And then, this will also remove the need to feed the people that come to the office, etc. So I think there will be more of this. I don't think it will be totally replaced by a digital world. way we live. Because, I mean, here's an example. I was talking to a friend whose son has just started a job as the manager of the offices of a foreign corporation here in Istanbul. You know, just as he took office, the crisis struck. So they went into home office arrangements. The problem is that the manager doesn't know his staff. And by just running home office arrangements, he cannot get to know them well enough. He doesn't know their sort of proclivities. They don't communicate through body language. They don't gossip. They don't have private moments to talk to each other. There is no opportunity for camaraderie, etc. So, you know, this will not be totally changed, but there will be more of it. And then, as we are doing today, there will be greater use of webinars. There will be greater use of virtual committee meetings. You know, in fact, again, just to give an example, I'm on the executive committee of an international organization, and we were to meet in the United States, but we couldn't do that. So we had a virtual meeting, and actually it proved to be very efficient. We had more time for committee meetings, etc. So it worked very nicely. My question remains, however, whether this would have worked out if we hadn't known each other in prior encounters. So I would venture to say maybe this may bring in a bit more democracy to our life, because, you know, now since, you know, we can consult people more regularly through webinars and whole committee meetings, it becomes easier to consult people and engage in groupthink. So this is one thing. But the alternative danger is, of course, when people are not around, it is really very difficult to be influential on the behavior of the decision makers. So it can go. It will, of course, this will also reduce the need for travel and hotels and etc. We will see. And one thing that's sort of interesting, people that have been reluctant to use the internet for a variety of purposes, from banking to internet shopping, etc., have now the experience, they have been forced into the experience of using the internet. And if they were hesitant to use these before the pandemic, they are now more used to shopping on the internet and do their business, etc. So I think this will also be affecting the way we operate. And also, you know, the process of redefining the functions of the private corporation will advance as I had described earlier, but maybe under two conflicting pressures. But, I mean, I think the pandemic will force a broader definition of corporate goals and functions than just delivering the highest return on the investment to the shareholders. But the current economic downturn may slow down the adoption of new approaches, since survival, which means maximization of income, will take precedence over other considerations. So I went through quite a lot, I guess.
Well, I was going to ask you first, when you mentioned China and the...
Hello.
Oh, yep. I think there's a bit of a delay with the sound. When you mentioned China and the disruption, you know, to supply routes and perhaps a tendency for multinationals to look for new suppliers, I was going to ask you about, you know, Turkey, how Turkey might fit into that picture, and I'll want to ask you that, you know, specifically, but more broadly, I'm curious. to hear what you have seen in Turkey throughout this process, how these trends have played out, well, where we are today.
Mhm. Well, you know, I think what I might do is simply give you a brief review of how things look like in Turkey, maybe that could provide a broad answer to the number of questions you have posed. I think it appears at the moment that Turkey is managing the pandemic reasonably well and possibly better than some societies. This is partly because the virus came late by coincidence. And again, by coincidence, Turkey had a much larger number of intensive care units than many other countries. And the public health system displayed a level of competence and demonstrated a sense of sacrifice that is really to be commended. And the pandemic, as I tried to indicate earlier, provided an opportunity for universities, high schools, and even primary schools to hold virtual classes, and companies managed to set up home offices. I think these will remain in part after the pandemic. I don't know how this will go, but I have some ideas. Like, you know, one of the problems we have in any educational system is that some students do not perform very well, and also during the year, and they have to have remedial classes. And you know, it is probably easier to conduct remedial classes on the internet for a fewer number of students rather than holding class formally in a building with teachers. So this might be one thing. And again, you know, with a lot of universities in different parts of Turkey, it might be simply more convenient to offer some of the courses in internet form given by very distinguished people when they have difficulties recruiting qualified instructors on the local scene. So this will be something that is in the making. There is a clear growth of internet shopping, and there is a major drop of business tourism, airlines business, and these are foreign exchange generators for the Turkish economy. And you know, unfortunately, this is coming at a time when the need of the Turkish economy for you know, I think intensified. The government appears to express hope that because Turkey is doing relatively well in fighting the virus, it might constitute a destination for tourists from abroad. We have yet to see this because the crisis is not over, and my concern would be that many people would be reluctant to travel, even if a country is deemed to be safer than others. So then, you know, the Turkish government developed programs to extend support to the unemployed and to the ailing small and mid-sized enterprises. But I am not really judge the effectiveness of these measures since many are just being implemented. And the government has also engaged in extending support in the form of medical supplies and materials to allies and poorer countries. Now, this is intended to improve the souring relations, for example, with NATO allies, including the United States. I am not able to judge that this is going to have the positive effect that the Turkish government hopes that it will. There is some hope that Turkey might constitute an effective supplier as an alternative to China. And this is a possibility, but two factors that have their origins in the pre-pandemic period are likely to pose difficulties to Turkey's recovery. One of them is the heavy external debt, and its refinancing may prove to be highly problematical. And secondly, the political environment is less than attractive for foreign investors because Turkey is perceived not to have a sufficiently reliable rule of law system. It is perceived as a country whose business policies fluctuate, doesn't have stability, and they perceive the government to display growing authoritarian tendencies that may eventually feed into political instability. So let me just stop there and we'll continue maybe. Huh?
Yeah, you mentioned Turkey having the potential to become an alternate to China, well, at least for some industries. And that seems clearly to be the case. And there were signs of this actually when the pandemic first hit, when it first hit China.
Factors that have their origins in the pre-Turkey's recovery, and its refinancing may prove to be highly problematical. The political environment is less than attractive for an investment. Who's speaking?
I think again the sound may have been somewhat delayed, but I don't know if you're hearing me in real time.
I hear you now. Yeah.
Okay, good. No, I was just saying that at the start of the pandemic, when the pandemic first hit China, at least, there were some signs that at least some multinationals were looking or had begun looking to Turkey, particularly in the textile sector. So textile producers in Turkey all of a sudden were receiving more and more orders. I think the industry, saw something like 10%, a 10% increase in exports in the first 2 months of the year. Of course, by the time the pandemic, reached Turkey, that went into reverse. But clearly, it signaled that there was potential, but for Turkey. But you also drew attention to the fact that Turkey does need external financing, and for these companies to be able to thrive in that post-COVID environment, reforms will have to take place, and ways to secure that external financing investment will be necessary. I wanted to maybe ask a couple more questions. One, I think you touched on briefly already, and that was the role of international institutions and maybe the prospects for regional integration. Now, normally, when I say normally, this is possibly a Hollywood version of what the world is supposed to look like during a pandemic. You would have imagined a greater role for international institutions during a crisis like this one. But that does not seem to have materialized for the time being. My question to you is, will it materialize? Is there any chance? Is there a window of opportunity for more global governance, for more regional integration?
Well, in fact, that may be the next form globalization takes. I think maybe globalization as a process that would integrate the entire globe into one economic community was too much to swallow, and there were too many differences. I think maybe global were pursuing, and this created a lot of problems. And one example would be, economic community, etc. These were all serious problems, and if you sort of operate within, there's a greater sharing of values and understandings of how, it might be easier to work together. So I think there may be a tendency for regional efforts to integration. However, I mean, there are limits to this. And because in the end, I mean, the reason why globalization was proceeding reasonably rapidly was because people perceived many advantages from it. They would get, I mean, many things cheaper. I think if we allowed, for example, the Americans to make all the cell phones, you would have to buy a cell phone for no less than twice what you have to pay for it today. It's made in Mexico, or it's made in Malaysia, or it's made in China, and labor is simply cheaper there. And similarly, for textiles, I think China was producing mass producing textiles, thousands and millions of meters, and it was very cheap. Now the question is, are people willing to buy more expensive clothes so that they will be assured of a varied resource, or source rather? So this is a question that is going to constitute an important source of debate, uh, because hidden in this is another question as to how to organize your society and expand its resources. And this is something that I referred to a little bit. Obviously, there is a greater need to develop public health systems. Now, if you don't have a good public health system, you could probably export, say, textiles more cheaply. But if you have an expensive public health system, inevitably some of the cost would be reflected into production or export prices. So this is going to be a painful process of adjustment. And I think societies that are already more prosperous will force other societies to introduce measures, or at least as for compensatory taxation. This will, of course, run counter then to global economic integration. But let me say once again, our powers of prediction tend to be of the linear kind and inevitably go wrong. And anything I say, I would caution, don't believe it, because our ability to predict has been constantly proven wrong. I mean, I think one might be a bit more accurate on the next stage of already ongoing trends, but making predictions on totally new developments will be extremely difficult.
Yeah, I mean, what makes it even harder is that, in a way, our horizons have narrowed. A lot of us have been, confined to our homes, and then have begun experiencing the world online. And there are obviously trends taking shape right now that a lot of us are struggling to perceive. And also, some of us are among the privileged few who can work from home, who can do what we did before, to some extent, at least online, and yet the majority do not. The majority, are struggling mightily, and many, do not even have the luxury of a choice whether to go to work or not.
Exactly.
You go to work because the alternative is poverty and unemployment, etc. One last question, if I may, and you've been very generous with your time, on NATO. Now, NATO member countries have committed to, have this 2% target. They have committed to spending 2% of their GDP on defense. And President Trump has been quite adamant about NATO countries meeting those commitments. It seems that this is going to be quite difficult to pull off in the current economic environment. So with that reduction of expenditure, And with everything else that we're seeing, the focus on pandemic response as opposed to focus on defense and the like, what does at least the short-term future look like for NATO?
Well, let me say that, we have talked about the fact that crises might sometimes constitute an opportunity. And I think maybe one of the things that came out during the crisis is that the military can play a rather important role in the delivery of supplies and flying the sick to different places and setting up temporary field hospitals, etc. So in fact, some countries may actually try to meet this 2% requirement by transferring some new functions to the military and then say this is a military activity. But more broadly, if we look at NATO, we see some real problems. I mean, you look at Eastern Europe, and their basic concern is to make sure that there is a defense mechanism that can defend them against possible Russian encroachments. Real problems. I mean, you look at East, their basic concern is to make sure that there is a defense, and to maybe Hungary are sensitive about that. This is one area. But then there is another source of concern that Europe will not be able to defend itself alone unless American defense is guaranteed of the continent. And by all indications, the United States is more and more trying to disengage from a defense of Europe. If the United States does not lead NATO, can a NATO survive? Now let me make one general observation. International organizations have a tendency to survive when they, in fact, no longer serve a particularly useful purpose. Let me remind you of the example of CENTO, the Central Treaty Organization. People may have forgotten about this, but this was part of the network of pacts that were designed to encircle the Soviet Union and it's the Soviet bloc. And in Europe, it was NATO, then Central Treaty Organization, originally bearing the name Baghdad Pact, included Turkey and Iraq and Iran and Pakistan, but Pakistan was also a member of CETO, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. So this was an encirclement. But, 2 years after the pact was established, there was a revolution in Iraq, and Iraq dropped out of the arrangement. So the organization was renamed the Central Treaty Organization rather than the Baghdad Pact. And it continued without necessarily serving a particularly useful purpose. It had its headquarters in Ankara. It had a secretary general that rode in a car with diplomatic plates. They had higher paid civil servants doing nothing. And it only came to an official end when there was the Humanite revolution in Iran as well. So NATO may actually continue to exist without serving the purposes for which it may have been initially established. But its survival is further enhanced by two factors. Number one, the EU does not have a particularly reliable security mechanism. And secondly, to ensure the security of Europe, you cannot rely only on the members of the European Union. You need a broader defense arrangement. And I'm not just referring to Turkey, I'm referring also to Great Britain in this. And also maybe some other potential members. So I think NATO will be around, and depending on what Russia does and what else happens, it may actually acquire regained importance. And I am also inclined to think that if Mr. Trump goes, there is a rather sizable part of the American political establishment that is interested in preserving NATO under American leadership. In fact, you go to the Munich Security Conference and other similar arrangements, what you discover is that there is a large contingent of American senators and congressmen and a large contingent of American bureaucrats that come to these meetings as if to challenge Mr. Trump's dictum that the United States should not any longer contribute as much to the defense of Europe. So, I mean, with the change of American administration and changing conditions, the NATO might acquire new vitality, but it will also probably have to develop some capabilities that are designed to cope with the emergencies like the pandemic, for which it is not at the moment particularly suitable, but for which it has the capability to organize.
I think charting the future of NATO and international affairs is already challenging enough without Trump. But if you were to assume another 4 years of Trump, then the number of variables just becomes too bewildering. But I think that's a conversation to be had a few months from now, maybe in late November. And well, I hope to reconnect at least before then. Thank you again for your time. Apologies for the technical glitches to anyone following right now, and well, hope to do this again soon in real life or perhaps again online. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Piotr, for your wonderful moderating.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.